Well, good evening, and I am one of your hosts for this evening. I'm Carrie Blaze, a staff lawyer at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and I'm pleased to be joined this evening by my colleague, Crystal Ann Roussel. She is also a lawyer at CELA and the Water Policy Coordinator with our Healthy Great Lakes program. So this evening, we are going to be discussing environmental assessment, participation, and your environmental rights. And before we actually get into the details of our presentation, just a few housekeeping notes. So this is a Zoom meeting, which means you have full control of your video, your microphone, but we do ask that you keep your mic off until the Q&A in about 40 minutes time. We are recording this session. We won't record the Q&A, so you can speak openly, but we are recording this session and we will be posting the slides and the recording to our YouTube channel following this evening. So a bit about the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Perhaps some of you are familiar with our work. Perhaps some of you have signed up to our monthly e-bulletin, which you can do through our website at cela.ca. But for those of you who may be new this evening, a short introduction to us. We are a public interest law organization dedicated to environmental equity, justice, and health. We were founded in 1970, and we are an environmental legal aid clinic, which means that we provide free legal services to low-income individuals, disadvantaged communities, and those who need financial support from Legal Aid Ontario. We represent a range of clients, and we do a lot of public legal education, such as tonight's webinar, to educate about environmental rights and the ways you can stand up for your health, air, land, and nature. So the topic for tonight's webinar came about based on a number of requests we've received from members of the public and those we work with to have a webinar specifically about environmental assessment, but not just a how-to guide on environmental assessment, but one that was actually tied to a specific project. And so coming up in March, there will be a hearing for a mine that is proposed for the town of Marathon in Northern Ontario. And this is a mining project that consists of 3 open pits, an ore processing plant, tailings and rock storage facilities, and also the accompanying infrastructure from roads and transmission lines. And this mine would operate for a period of about 12.5 years and produce about 25,000 tons of ore per day. And the ore body that's being mined contains palladium, copper, and platinum. So we're going to use this project as our case study as we work through the public opportunities to participate within an environmental assessment, but also what is an environmental assessment. So this evening, we're going to start with the basics. What's the value in participating? Whether you're an individual or a community group, what is your value and how can you actually utilize the environmental assessment process to voice your concerns? And then we'll end with how you can actually voice your concerns for this specific hearing if you are looking to be engaged in the Marathon Mine project. So I want to begin by unpacking a term perhaps some of you have heard, which is the phrase environmental justice. What is it and how does it relate to environmental assessment? So put simply, environmental justice is this idea that when everyone can meaningfully participate, no group, no community should be affected with inequitable impacts from a decision. So, while Canada's economy has long benefited from our natural resources, there is an environmental and health burden that has accompanied this prosperity. And the impacts to local ecosystems and the byproducts, which often are introduced as a result of this industrial activity, can have lasting impacts. And all too often, as we know, the communities that bear the inequitable environmental health burden, as a result of this past and present industrial activity, are often those who had least say in the decision-making process. And so this evening, what we want to do is unpack how individuals and communities can become involved prior to these formative decisions being made. So the environmental justice principle has a number of procedural elements to it. Procedurally, it means that everyone has an opportunity to meaningfully participate in government decisions that affect their life and their health and their environment. And it also means that everyone has access to fair, timely, thorough information so that you're informed when you're participating in these processes. And as we've encapsulated on this slide, that is known as the right to know or the right to information. And so if we're to advance environmental justice and reverse the trend where those most detrimentally affected are those with least power or the least say, public participation provides that starting point. And as Dr. Robert Gibson, who is a scholar and environmental assessment expert, has so clearly put, and we've quoted him here on the slide, affected citizens and public interveners have repeatedly proved to be the most powerfully motivated and the most capable at critically reviewing environmental assessment documents and leading to better results. So public participation, it's a two-way communication. It's a two-way dialogue. Not only does it give you the opportunity to share what concerns you about a project, it gives the government decision maker, be it a regulator, the impact assessment agency, it gives them the input they need to actually decide what could be or is in the public's interest. And by doing so, this enhances the legitimacy of the decision that's made. It leads to greater accountability because the decision maker now has to pair their analysis, their assessment with the facts that support their position. And ultimately, it can produce a result that is more attuned to community needs and community values. And unfortunately, if it weren't for environmental assessment, there might not be any other opportunity to voice your concerns about a project. And I raise this as a critical point because environmental assessment in Ontario, in Canada, is significantly restricted. Not all projects that have an adverse impact on the environment undergo an environmental assessment. And so if you do find yourself in the situation that there is an environmental assessment occurring for a project in your community, in your neighborhood, I fully encourage you to participate because there may not be any other mechanism that allows you to have access to that level of information and feedback with those who are making the decision. So now we're going to move into the nuts and bolts of environmental assessment. It will become a little bit more technical. So environmental assessments emerged in the 70s and 80s and were gradually taken up in law. And now environmental assessment is one of the most widely practiced environmental management tools worldwide. Initially, environmental assessments began so that we could study the consequences of a major development before the development happened, and we were looking at the environmental impacts. But now environmental assessment has grown that we're not just looking at the environmental impacts, but the social impacts, impacts to health, impacts to community, and sustainability. And so there's no one definition, there's no one size fits all for EA, but broadly speaking, it's a process that aims to identify, predict, evaluate, mitigate, the whole host of adverse impacts from physical to social to health, socioeconomic, again, before that formative development happens or before major decisions occur such that it's not possible to reverse them. And so fundamentally, in any EA process, in any environmental assessment process, that is what we are trying to do. There's a number of hallmarks as well. So you might be familiar with the phrase cumulative effects. And so within an environmental assessment process, one of the hallmarks of what will be assessed are the cumulative effects of a project. And so what is this and what does it mean? So we'll pause for a moment just on the phrase cumulative effects. So these are changes to the environment that are caused by actions in combination with past, present, or future activities. It can be linear in that each incremental change has the same effect on the environment, or it could be an exponential change, wherein every incremental addition is exponentially more than the preceding, or it could be discontinuous, where there is no relationship between the new effects to the environment. Some examples of cumulative effects in the mining context, considering, are there multiple mines within one watershed? If it's one watershed but multiple mines, there could be a cumulative effect due to the high spatial density of the activities and their effects. Likewise, if you had multiple industries located, let's say, alongside a river, there would be compounding effects because of the heavy metal emissions, let's say, or the chemical contamination caused by not one but multiple industries along one water body. In the case of the Marathon mine that's proposed, the proponent was required under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act to consider cumulative effects. And so I'll just give you a snapshot of how they undertook a cumulative effects analysis for the Marathon project. So among the considerations that were considered in Marathon were the residual impacts of air emissions, when there could be exceedances of air quality standards and guidelines. What would the lasting impacts be to surface water due to the dewatering of lakes or streams? It also looked at long-term disturbances to moose and bear and wolf and deer populations that would be caused by land clearing. And it also assessed the cumulative impact on endangered species like caribou, where the assessment did find that the loss in connectivity between the habitats of various caribou herds between the Naze and Pukasaw protected areas could lead to declining caribou herds. So another hallmark of environmental assessment, so the third bullet point on the slide, is something called an alternatives assessment. So within the broader environmental assessment framework, there will be consideration of alternatives to conducting a project, and also alternative means of conducting that project. So let's first deal with alternative means to a project. So this is when the proponent has to consider different ways of carrying out the same project. So it means, should the road utilize an existing road or build a new road? Should we have diesel generation or should we have transmission lines? So again, it's that weighing of alternatives. So you're tweaking the activities already within the project. Whereas alternatives to the project are considering different ways of addressing the same outcome. So for the Marathon mine, what the proponent did, it examined a few alternatives, and this was the alternatives of doing nothing. It was also an alternative of expanding existing operations in Montana, and they also looked at expanding recycling facilities. And ultimately, they found that those alternatives didn't satisfy their overall goal, which was for geographic diversification of their operations. So, oops, sorry about that. My mouse is jumping all over the place. Okay, so once my mouse starts to cooperate, I'll continue. Sorry about that. All right, so to summarize that very lengthy slide, we need environmental assessment for a number of reasons. It's to allow us the time to avoid, minimize, prevent environmental harm from development, such that we can address environmental injustices and prevent those disproportionate impacts on what we know occurs, in lower income and Indigenous communities. And it also provides a voice for the public, a forum, so that the public can actually voice their concerns prior to development happening. Okay, so now you might be wondering, environmental assessment, you understand the process, what it contains, but where does it actually originate in the legal landscape? So in Canada, we have a revised or a newer environmental assessment law, and that is called the Impact Assessment Act. And that came out in 2019. And so while so far I've been using the phrase environmental assessment, I could say impact assessment and they would mean the same thing. So there is a change in terminology. However, until 2019, when this new act came out, projects were being reviewed under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act of 2012, hence the terminology environmental assessment. And the Marathon Palladium Mine project is actually being reviewed under the short form SIA 2012 and not the Impact Assessment Act. And so depending upon the project you're interested in participating in, definitely double check, is it an impact assessment or is it an environmental assessment? Because there are differences in timelines, there's differences in the stages that the process will go through. Again, those fundamental, cumulative effects assessment and alternatives, that will all still be there, but the kind of more the logistical details there are some differences. So this evening, we're going to be looking at a project that's going on under SIA 2012. And so for that reason, I've prepared this summary chart that tries to compare on the left-hand side what you're looking at under a SIA 2012 environmental assessment versus what you would be looking at if it was an impact assessment under the new act that came out in 2019. And so again, there are similarities to both. So with any environmental law, when you're trying to understand what it's trying to do, what it wants to accomplish, you want to check out the purpose. And so under SIA 2012, there is a purpose statement found at section 4 of the Act, and it seeks to encourage sustainable development and protect the environment. It also aims to ensure meaningful public participation. And that is actually a commonality between the old SIA 2012 and the new Impact Assessment Act. However, where the two acts differ, under the Impact Assessment Act, there are new provisions for fostering sustainability, protecting environment, health, social and economic conditions, as well as Indigenous knowledge and taking into account cooperation with Indigenous jurisdictions, should they be recognized under the Act. And so there is some overlap, but just to make note, there are some updates and some upgrades, I would say. So you want to understand which act you're falling under, given the project you might be interested in participating in. For the most part, projects are proceeding, of course, under the new act, but there are some that were transitioned into SIA 2012. So within the environmental assessment framework, the decision maker will also be paying attention to certain factors. And so these are kind of clearly labeled in the Act, the factors to be considered within the EA. And so again, in the middle column, you'll see those items which are in common to both acts. So the decision maker will be considering environmental effects, mitigation, the purpose of the project and alternatives, and the effect of accidents and malfunctions. Whereas again, under the Impact Assessment Act, we are seeing some changes, such as the decision maker has to consider impacts to Indigenous people and cultures, and whether a project contributes to sustainability and also helps or hinders Canada's obligations when it comes to climate. Okay, so now that you understand environmental assessment, what considerations inform the process, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Crystal, who's joined us this evening, and she's going to walk you through how you can actually find out what environmental assessments are happening near you. Over to you, Crystal.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, so as Carrie mentioned, I'm just going to spend the next few slides showing you around the Canadian Impact Assessment Registry. And Carrie will share some links in the chat box as we go along. So please feel free to follow along on your own screen and learn how to interact with the registry kind of as we go through this. So what exactly is the Canadian Impact Assessment Registry? It's essentially an online tool that allows you to access information related to impact assessments under the Impact Assessment Act, projects carried out on federal lands by other government departments, crown corporations, strategic and regional assessments under the Impact Assessment Act, and any ongoing environmental assessments under SIA 2012. So if you want to find out what projects are happening near you and if they're covered under SIA or the Impact Assessment Act, you could check out the registry. It's a great tool to use to research and find out about approved or ongoing environmental assessments in your area. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do you find projects on the registry? The homepage offers a number of options. You can search using keywords to locate assessments, browse a list of active assessments, use an interactive map like the one you see on the screen here to view assessments, or find a list of current opportunities. So on this slide, we're looking at the interactive map tool. And using this, you can search for projects based on location. You can also search using keywords to locate assessments, or by entering a title or type of assessment, a place name. You can locate assessments within a distance of your choice from a location or a point on the map using the Near Me tool. You can also use some filters such as type or nature of activity to narrow your search. And then to find more information about a particular assessment, you can click the individual blue dots that you see on the slide here to open a pop-up window to view some basic information about that assessment. And the dots are related to the footprint, aren't related to the footprint of the project, sorry, they're just placeholders. And the location of a given assessment included is kind of approximate based on the information submitted by proponents. So more than one location may be identified for any given assessment. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, you can also find a particular assessment by doing a keyword search by place name, name of the proponent, or name of project if you happen to know it. On this page that you see now, there's a column on the left where you can apply certain filters to your search. You'll see we've expanded it kind of on this right side of the slide. So for example, you can filter your search by assessment status or assessment type. The assessment status gives you an indication of whether the project is completed, in progress, or terminated. If a project is still in progress, there will likely be opportunities still to participate, so definitely keep an eye out on those ones. And for those which are already completed, final decisions and all of the documents will be posted. So this information can be really helpful if you wish to understand what was agreed to, what conditions were put in force, and also kind of understand the nature of the project. For instance, what activities are involved, who's the proponent, what is the project's lifespan. And I won't go into too much detail about what's meant by assessment type, but essentially under SIA 2012 and under the Impact Assessment Act, there are different types of assessments. So as you can see, the most common type is a project on federal lands assessment. Unfortunately, this is the least robust form of environmental assessment and involves just a cursory analysis of whether there will be significant adverse environmental effects for a project occurring on federal lands. And there's a mandatory 30-day public comment period, but that's really all that's required. Another assessment type is an environmental assessment under SIA 2012, of which there are currently 38, and this would include the Marathon Mine environmental assessment. And then you can also see there are impact assessments being undertaken by the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. Next slide, please. And I think that's back over to you, Carrie.
Thanks, Crystal. Okay, so picking up on that, we also want to provide a snapshot of the opportunities you have within the environmental assessment process to provide input. So we did mention there's many phases and stages to an EA, and so this chart just summarizes when you can have an opportunity to comment. And so it does begin early on. So before the decision maker decides whether there should be an impact assessment or an environmental assessment, they release a project description. And so when a proponent is planning a project, the proponent has to provide some details to the agency, the impact assessment agency, and that is posted to the registry that Crystal just went through. And there's like a 20-day comment period where you can comment on the sufficiency, the level of detail of that project description. And if an environmental assessment is required, it's at the next stage that the agency would issue a notice of commencement and say, yes, the EA has commenced and the process will continue. So it's really critical at number one, so the summary of the project description, that you indicate that yes, you believe this project should undergo a full environmental assessment, because then it may trigger the full process. So assuming it does move along in the process, the next opportunity you have to engage is when the draft guidelines come out that inform how the environmental impact statement will be undertaken. So the proponent is required to undertake a number of assessments and studies and write that up into a document called the environmental impact statement. But first, the agency with the public have to agree upon what are the parameters, what are the nuts and bolts that have to go into that EIS document. And so this is a critical stage where you can comment on whether or not it's sufficient. Has climate change been adequately considered? Have species at risk been adequately considered? And you're just flagging, the value parameters or the concerns that you think should be front of mind so that they are studied and reviewed as the process continues. So for the Marathon Mine project, it was following the release of the guidelines that it was then referred to a review panel. And there is another way environmental assessments happen, which is just an agency decision, not a review panel, but we're not going to get into that tonight. So it was referred to a review panel for the Marathon Mining project. And then the environmental impact statement was released. And so public comments were invited on that document and the studies that accompany it. And it's at that stage, there's a number of information requests as well that go back and forth between the review panel and the proponent. So if there's gaps in the information in the environmental impact statement that's provided, that can be remedied by way of addendums. And so a number of information requests, again, back and forth on specific topics. And once the review panel deems that there's sufficient information that they feel they can meet the purposes of the Act and continue with their decision making, that's when they notice or when they issue a notice of public hearing. So that is now the stage we find ourselves at with the Marathon Palladium mine. The public hearing notice has been released. It's notifying the public that there is a public hearing coming up and that there is an opportunity for the public to raise their concerns. Once again, building upon whether you had concerns in the prior stages or maybe you're new to the process and you're looking to engage with the review panel, the public hearing provides that final step to actually comment on the project. So this is kind of what I just reviewed, but in more detail. This slide is included in our presentation, so you have it for your notes and for your reference at a later date. We're not going to go over it in any more detail this evening, just to note that this is the process start to finish for an environmental assessment under SIA 2012, the prior act, which is where the Marathon Mining project is continuing. And likewise, this slide is the revised Impact Assessment Act and the multi-stage process it goes through, and you can note the different icons for public participation. And this is a link we will include in our PowerPoint slides, and so you can always click on it, and each of those stages is detailed in much more detail on their websites. So now we're getting to the end. So we have the hearing. The hearing has been scheduled. It will be happening mid-March. And in my mind, this is honestly the most exciting part of the environmental assessment, because you actually get to address the review panel. So you can actually, instead of just writing your comments, you can address individuals, the decision makers, and tell them your story, why you're concerned, and why you're here. So if you are participating in the marathon environmental assessment public hearing, you're given a choice. Are you a generalist? Are you topic specific? Or are you participating in a community session? And so public hearing guidelines have been released, and we'll have links to that later in the presentation, so you can click on them. But in the general hearing session, members of the public will have 15 minutes to present their views on the project and potential environmental effects. Whereas a topic-specific session, you'll have 20 minutes, but that's more intended for experts on specific technical areas. So hydrogeology or climate effects, let's say, or species at risks. And so generally speaking, if you are a concerned member of your community and you're not speaking to one topic individually, I'd recommend you choose the general hearing option. Then you have to decide, do you want to appear in writing and in person, or on Zoom? It'll be a virtual hearing that's actually live streamed over YouTube. So do you want to present in writing, or with a 15-minute time slot, or one of the other? So you have a few decisions to make. And once you've made those decisions, you do have to register. So the email address is there on the slide, but you do need to register no later than February 12th. And you have to tell them your name or the name of your group if you're appearing on behalf of a number of individuals, a short synopsis of what you want to present, what your concern is, and if you're represented by a lawyer or not. That's not a requirement. And you also have to indicate if you need a translator or not. And now I will pass it back to Crystal, who will review how you can actually prepare for the hearing day.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, so what should you say if you're participating in a hearing? So first of all, you'd want to speak to why this matters. Why is it important? Whether you're appearing over Zoom for a 20-minute presentation or you decide to give comments in writing, try to make your comments persuasive. Engage with the panel, try to tell them a story and connect your concerns to your personal story. If you have any questions for the panel, or if you feel like something hasn't been addressed yet, make sure to say so. Essentially, you want to highlight the importance and the urgency of the matter you're raising. You'll also want to address the key issue or issues you're concerned about. Try to frame your presentation around one or two key issues, and also be careful not to state the issues too broadly. So keep your presentation or submission focused with facts to support it. And again, you can draw on your personal story to try and highlight these key issues. Also, when thinking about which key issues you want to present, try to remember the purposes of the Act as set out in SIA 2012 or in the Impact Assessment Act, and the list of factors that must be considered before a decision can be made. And Carrie went over these in a few slides back. So for example, do you have unanswered concerns about physical impacts to air, water, land, plants, or animals? Or do you have concerns about human impacts, like impacts to culture, health, community, sustainability, financial benefits, employment? And you can raise both positives and negatives, but you want to focus on the gaps that must be remedied before the project is decided. And then finally, what are the facts? So your presentation should contain the facts and background information necessary to give context to your key issues and concerns. And in the next slide, we'll share some links where you can find key documents from the proponents. You can also raise facts independent of the studies or written materials of the proponent. You can, again, share your own experience and your own knowledge. And for those who have applied for participant funding, you might even have a report from an expert, such as a hydrogeologist or a species at risk biologist, that you can share and build on. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here are some links where you can find the key documents from the proponents. These will all be helpful in terms of preparing your presentation for the hearing. And the compilation of key documents, which is the last link on this slide, is particularly helpful. It's kind of like a one-stop shop resource for the proponent's environmental impact statement and accompanying studies, all of their responses to information requests from the review panel in the lead up to the hearing. So that's all for our presentation today. So thank you so much for joining.